The older brother received a box of chocolates from his father on his birthday, thinking it was a sign of reconciliation after years of silence. But he had no idea that very gift, once passed on to his younger brother and nephew, would spark a chilling tragedy. What could possibly be so bad that a child nearly lost their life over a few pieces of candy? Stay with us for this intense and gripping story. Daniel used to be a soldier, not a desk job kind of soldier. He was Special Forces, Rapid Response Team, Frontline, classified missions. He'd been through Iraq, then Syria. Came back with scars on his back, and something deeper. The feeling that his own family had turned their backs on him. 3 years ago, Daniel blew the whistle on his direct commander, a man with close ties to his father, for taking bribes in an arms deal. At the time, Daniel thought he was doing the right thing, but George, his father, didn't see it that way. A retired colonel with a cabinet full of medals, George believed that airing dirty laundry was betrayal. Even if the laundry was rotting, you didn't touch it. He called Daniel the disgrace of the family. His mother stayed silent. Brian, his younger brother, raised by George to be the perfect replica, said nothing. They all cut him off that day. Daniel didn't reach out either. He moved to a log cabin in rural New Jersey, more than 20 miles from the nearest town. No social media, no cable TV, just trees, books, and the sounds of wild animals at night. He wasn't exactly living off the grid. Daniel still worked remotely, writing software for a small security firm. On weekends, he fixed up old trucks, trained hunting dogs, and occasionally sent handwritten letters to a few old military buddies. But when it came to family, he considered himself dead, and he figured they saw it the same way. Until his 39th birthday. That morning was cold, the windows fogged with thick mist. Daniel had just finished stacking firewood when he saw a delivery truck parked at the gate. The driver didn't say much, just handed him a small, neatly wrapped box. Daniel assumed it was some tool he'd ordered online. But when he opened it, the first thing he saw was a familiar logo, Whitman's Sampler, the classic chocolate brand his family used to buy every holiday. There was no card inside, no note, just a carefully chosen box of chocolates. Tiny lettering on the lid read, "Since 1842. His hand paused for a few seconds. No one but his father would have remembered that this brand of chocolate was part of a shared memory, something the three of them had every Christmas. Brian loved the caramel. Daniel always went for the dark chocolate with almonds. And George? He picked the raisin clusters, every time. Daniel set the box on the wooden table and just stared at it. He didn't open it right away. His mind ran through the possibilities. Maybe it was from Mom, maybe Brian, but no matter what, it had George's name all over it. He thought about sticking it in the fridge and forgetting it, just leaving it there, untouched, like a memory you're not sure you want to reopen. That afternoon, the phone rang. Unknown number. New Brunswick area code. He hesitated a few seconds before picking up. "Dan, it's Brian." The voice hadn't changed much, still spoke fast but without pressure, still sounded like the youngest son who'd been coddled his whole life, never once punched hard enough by the world to really bleed. "Sophie's got a work thing near your area," Brian continued. "Mind if I drop by for a bit? Just me and Max." Daniel paused. Max, Brian's son, was 5. Daniel had never met him. Wasn't even told when Sophie gave birth. But he'd heard things. The kid loved robots, was obsessed with Lego, and allergic to peanuts. "How long?" Daniel asked, voice flat. "About an hour, if that's cool." He didn't answer right away. Glancing again at the box of chocolates, still sitting silently on the table, Daniel let out a long breath. "All right," he said. "The road up here's rough. Turn your headlights on early." After he hung up, he felt a flicker inside. Not excitement, not full-blown suspicion either. More like standing in front of a door that had been locked for years, not sure if what's behind it is just dust or something else waiting. He straightened up the living room, wiped down the sofa, grabbed an extra bottle of water from the storage basement. Then he opened the box of chocolates and pulled out 2 caramel pieces for Max. The rest, he still wasn't sure what to do with them. The glass fogged with condensation as the gray SUV rolled up to the wooden gate. Headlights lit up the uneven gravel driveway. Daniel stood on the front porch, arms crossed, unmoving. The car door opened. Brian stepped out, heavy coat, hair neatly styled. Max followed, clutching his dad's arm with one hand, a plastic dinosaur in the other. Daniel nodded. No smile. Brian gave a faint smirk and wheeled a small suitcase up the steps. They stepped into the cabin. The scent of pine wood and warm candle wax hit immediately. "Wow, looks just like it used to," Brian said, his eyes scanning the minimalist space. "No one to clean, so I keep it simple," Daniel replied, voice level. Max wandered cautiously toward the wooden coffee table in the center of the room. Daniel knelt slightly, tapping a fingertip lightly against the boy's forehead. Max looked up and gave a shy smile. "You hungry?" Daniel asked. "I can eat anything, except peanuts," Max replied quickly. Brian laughed, loud and easy, like there had never been any distance between them. Daniel didn't respond. He just turned and walked into the kitchen. Dinner was simple: grilled meat, steamed vegetables, with mashed potatoes. Daniel wasn't much of a cook, but everything was prepared with care. He set the plates in front of father and son, poured water from a thermal jug. As they all sat down, Max glanced around, then pointed at the box of chocolates still sitting on the shelf. "Is that yours, Uncle?" Daniel glanced over, then got up, took it down, and placed it on the table. "Not really," he said. "Someone sent it, but I don't do sweets anymore." Brian raised an eyebrow. Recognizing the familiar box, he opened the lid and let Max pick the first piece. "This is the old-school kind," Brian said, a trace of nostalgia in his voice. "I used to eat these back in high school. Remember that?" Daniel didn't answer. He lifted his glass and took a long sip of water. Max bit into the first piece, eyes lighting up. "This is so good." "If you like it, take the whole box home," Daniel said flatly. "I won't eat it." Brian chuckled and patted his son on the back. Dinner passed with scattered conversation. Daniel didn't ask about the family, didn't mention their parents, didn't ask how Brian was doing. Brian didn't bring up the past either. They spoke like two strangers sharing a table by coincidence. At 8 o'clock, Brian stood up and told Max to brush his teeth. The boy trotted off to the bathroom, leaving the two men alone by the kitchen. "Thanks for letting us stop by," Brian said quietly. "Sophie doesn't know I brought Max. She still hasn't forgiven me for last time." "I don't need to know," Daniel replied, eyes fixed on the window frame. Brian nodded like he was used to being shut down that way. He cleared the plates, made a few half-hearted comments, and then took Max to the guest bed in the living room. Daniel finished cleaning up the kitchen, then sat alone in his office, reviewing a security design report from a partner firm. The wind whispered through the trees outside. The fireplace popped and crackled. A faint unease crept in. No clear reason, just a subtle shift in the air. Around midnight, just as Daniel was shutting his laptop, the phone rang. He looked at the screen, Sophie's number. "Daniel!" Her voice was hoarse, panicked. Brian and Max, they're at the hospital." "What happened?" "They started vomiting, stomach pain, then passed out. The ER said it might be food poisoning. They're running tests. Did you give them anything strange to eat?" "Just meat and potatoes," Daniel said slowly, "and a few pieces of chocolate." Silence. Then Sophie's voice cracked. "Do you even know where that box came from?" "It was delivered. No name." "Oh my God, Max is really weak. If there was anything in it, you have to tell the truth." Daniel could hear rushed footsteps, a hospital intercom blaring in the background. Then the call ended. No goodbye. At dawn, 2 police officers knocked on his door. They spoke fast, cold, direct. He was being asked to come in for questioning. Daniel didn't resist. At the county police station, the interrogation was relentless. Questions about the chocolate box, the meal, everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. One young officer kept repeating, "Did you have any reason to harm them?" Daniel didn't answer that question. Instead, he recited the menu, the number of candies, how Max picked his piece. Every detail, precise and calm, like a field report from a mission. After 6 hours of questioning, he was moved to a holding room. There was no solid evidence, but there was also no one speaking up for him. He sat in the cold room, gray walls closing in, staring at the stained ceiling under flickering light. He didn't sleep. He didn't speak. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt truly alone. Not because he'd been abandoned, but because this time, he wasn't sure if he was entirely innocent. He was released late in the afternoon. Police had no hard evidence, no strange traces in the kitchen, no fingerprints beyond the 3 of them. They spoke in a neutral tone, no accusations, no apologies. But the look in the older officer's eyes, just before he closed the file, said it all. We know you're involved. Daniel walked out of the station holding a plastic bag containing his phone, wallet, keys, and a sense of bone-deep exhaustion. The early winter wind cut through his collar, but he didn't zip up his jacket. On the drive back, he left the radio off. All he could see in his mind was Max, tiny, still, hooked up to hospital machines. Then Brian, pale, seizing, soaked in sweat. They had eaten the chocolates. The one thing he hadn't checked, the only part of the night he hadn't prepared himself. The cabin door shut behind him. Silence settled in. Daniel sat on the wooden chair, elbows on knees, shoulders heavy. He exhaled, slow, low, like the sound of timber under strain. Then he stood up, suddenly, and walked straight to the fridge. The chocolate box was still there, on the bottom shelf. The lid had been opened, several slots were empty. But in the far corner, one piece remained. A coconut-filled one nobody had touched. Daniel grabbed it with metal tongs and sealed it inside a small Ziploc bag. He threw on his coat, grabbed his keys, and drove straight to the private lab in the nearest town. The same place he'd once helped secure with a custom firewall years ago. The receptionist looked stunned when he walked in. No appointment, red eyes, hands trembling slightly. I need a food toxicity test. Urgent. Do you suspect something? I don't know, Daniel said. But if there's anything off in this, I need to know exactly what it is. He signed his name, left the chocolate sample, his email, and phone number. By the time he stepped outside, it was already dark. He didn't drive home. Instead, he sat in the car, unlocked his phone. 27 missed calls from Sophie. Texts were coming in non-stop. The last one was just a single line, no punctuation. Max will die if you keep hiding the truth. Daniel gripped the phone in his hand. Those words didn't sting because they were cruel. They stung because, deep down, he wasn't sure if he was hiding something. His mind went back to that night, the chocolate box that arrived. No card, no name. He hadn't checked it, thought it was harmless. But what if? What if someone left it there on purpose? Or worse, what if he handed over something dangerous without knowing? Daniel replayed every detail. Who opened the box? Brian. Who picked the first piece? Max. Who ate the most? Unclear. But Daniel remembered one thing with sickening clarity. He had pushed the box across the table toward them. His stomach turned. He felt like throwing up. The next morning, Daniel woke early, though he'd barely slept at all. He sat on the cabin's front steps, drinking cold water, watching low clouds drift across the trees. A squirrel darted across the porch, vanishing into the brush. Everything looked cruelly normal. Around 10 a.m., his phone rang. Unknown number, the lab. We've tested the chocolate you submitted, the technician said, voice calm but firm. Preliminary results show the presence of a compound not commonly found in food. What kind? Daniel asked. A chemical used in the aerospace industry, typically found in thermal sensor calibration systems. Extremely rare outside of engineering labs. Ingesting it can cause severe liver damage, especially in children. Daniel didn't speak. His grip on the phone tightened. We'll need another 24 hours to confirm the exact concentration, the technician continued. But we can say this with certainty. This is not a substance found in any normal food product. Daniel nodded, even though the person on the line couldn't see him. After the call ended, he sat in silence for a long time. That chemical, it didn't belong in any ordinary candy, especially not in a classic, family-style box of chocolates. He looked up at the wooden ceiling above the porch. The doubt that had been whispering at the edges of his mind was no longer subtle. It was sharp, precise, like a blade, but still, not enough to name, not enough to point a finger, just enough to know. Someone had set this up, and no matter how far Daniel had tried to stay away, he was now standing dead center in it. The lab results left Daniel frozen for hours. The question looping in his mind was no longer what happened. It was, who did this? And why? He sat at the wooden table, staring around the cabin, this place that had once been untouched, quiet, unbothered by the chaos of the outside world. Then a detail flashed through his memory. 3 months ago, Brian had called him, his voice hesitant, like he was trying to ask for something he couldn't quite say. Do you still have that 3D printer from your time in the military tech lab? What for? Max wants to make a toy armor set for a school project. The cheap plastic ones don't look real. I'd just borrow it for a week. Daniel had said yes. Brian came to pick it up. Sophie came with him. She didn't talk much, just looked around the cabin with guarded eyes. At the time, Daniel hadn't thought anything of it. But now everything felt off. The 3D printer, the technical tools, the mold kit, all of it was stored in the basement workshop, a space no one entered without a specific key. Daniel remembered locking the door. But then, he remembered something else. Brian had an old copy of the key. From years ago, back when he used to help Daniel fix things around the cabin. Daniel stood up and walked straight down to the basement. The door to the workshop was slightly ajar. He flipped on the lights, stepped slowly past the stacks of old equipment, toolboxes, power cords, scrap parts, and in the far corner of the room, the mini camera he had once set up to track wild mice. Still there, mounted tight against the ceiling corner, covered in dust. The battery was probably dead. But if the memory card was still intact, he pulled out the memory card, brought it upstairs, and slid it into his laptop. It took nearly an hour to sift through the footage. Most of it was pitch black. A few clips showed himself, coming down to grab tools or supplies. Then, 2:14 a.m., November 11th, 3 days before his birthday, a figure slipped in through the side door. Tall, broad shoulders, gray coat. Brian. Daniel froze the frame, stared straight into the grainy pale image of his brother's face, faintly lit by the night vision camera. Brian entered carrying a black bag. He went straight to the tool chest, started digging, attached something to the 3D printer's controller, then left. Gone in under 15 minutes. Daniel replayed the clip over and over. A cold line crawled up his spine. Not because it was Brian, but because of how comfortable he looked doing it. Like this wasn't the first time, not even close. He dug back into old folders on his hard drive, archives from his time in the military, old security tools, backup logs. Inside an unnamed folder, buried deep in a directory labeled test audio, he found a lone.mp4 audio file. He hit play, static. Then, Brian's voice, smooth, confident. "Greg, are you sure that stuff won't leave a trace? As long as the dose is low, cops will think it's just bad food." "What about Max? He eats first, gets a lighter hit. The target's Daniel. We need someone to blame." Daniel's chest tightened like a vice. He shut the laptop, pushed his chair back like the computer might bite. His heart pounded. The room felt smaller by the second. He braced his hands on the table, trying to breathe. There was no more doubt. Everything was clear now. Brian, it was him all along. He orchestrated everything, engineered the incident to frame Daniel. Maybe to pressure their father into splitting the inheritance, maybe to cash in on insurance, maybe both. And Max? The kid was just a pawn in his father's twisted game. Daniel sat there, frozen in silence. Every second was like ice melting away, not from doubt, but from clarity. He no longer feared he'd made a mistake, no longer worried he'd been careless. He knew. He had been the target from the beginning, and that last hit, just the opening move. He didn't know how long he sat there in the dark, but when he finally stood, his hands were numb, and the recording still echoed in his ears like metal scraping against stone. No more theories, no more maybes. This was proof. He hit play again. Brian's voice, clear, deliberate, talking about the incident like it was a casual tactic in a strategy game. And Greg, calm, steady, older, speaking the language of someone who'd done this before. This wasn't impulsive. This was methodical, planned. Daniel reopened the old folder, dug deeper into the hidden files. He found an Excel sheet titled Budget 2023. But it wasn't a budget. It was a mess of transactions, a flood of crypto movements, wallet addresses, transfer amounts. Some entries were marked loan payback with notes like, "Repay Greg before October." But one column stood out, labeled Claim Expected. Next to it, a note, $500K, insurance on ingestion case, kid survives. Daniel just stared, silent, still, stunned. Brian was drowning in debt, and he hadn't just tried to stage a poisoning, he'd counted on Max surviving, planned it that way, so there'd be a living witness, a clean insurance claim, and a double blow. Frame Daniel, collect $500,000, pressure their father into dividing the estate once the scandal exploded. Daniel couldn't wrap his head around how someone could knowingly put their own child in real danger. But with everything now laid out in front of him, he had no choice but to act. He copied every piece of data, the audio recording, the financial spreadsheets, the infrared camera footage, and the purchase receipts for custom hardware, all onto a new USB drive. He double-checked every folder. then slid the USB into the inner lining pocket of his jacket. The next day, he made a call to the one person he trusted to help without asking too many questions. Rachel Mendez, a civil attorney who'd once helped him during a fast-track discharge appeal. Conveniently, Rachel also happened to be a college friend of Sophie's. They'd worked together in the DA's office back in 2012. Daniel met Rachel in a small second-floor office inside an old, unmarked building. She wore a dark button-down shirt, shadows under her eyes from too many late nights. But when Daniel said, "I have something you need to see, and Sophie should see it too," she didn't ask a single question, just nodded and locked the door. He handed her the USB, then walked her through every piece of it, point by point, leaving nothing out. Rachel played the audio file first, then scanned the transaction spreadsheet. Her face darkened with every minute. When she reached the claim expected note, she looked up, took off her glasses. "Are you certain this data is real? Extracted from my own system, my own camera, my own memory card." Rachel said nothing more. She picked up her phone, dialed. A short call. 10 minutes later, Sophie walked in. Thin hoodie, hair tied up, no makeup. Her eyes were swollen and red, sleepless. She looked at Daniel. Her voice cracked. "Max woke up for a few minutes this morning. He asked, 'Where's Dad?' and I didn't know what to say." Daniel didn't respond. Rachel handed Sophie the laptop. It took less than 2 minutes for her to recognize her husband's voice in the recording. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just went still. Her face drained of color, shoulders collapsing like someone had flipped off her power switch. "I always knew something was off," she whispered. "Ever since he started hiding his phone, lying about work, but I never thought it would be this." Rachel gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sophie," she said, "if you're willing to testify, we can bring this directly to the DA's office. What Daniel brought in, it's strong enough to act on." Sophie nodded without hesitation. "I'll say everything. Every threat he made, every lie he told. I won't let Max grow up in the dark like this." Daniel stood up and stepped out into the hallway. He didn't need to hear the rest. Didn't know exactly what Rachel would do next. But he knew one thing for certain. This story no longer belonged to him alone. It was now part of a criminal case. And Brian would finally have to face the truth he tried so hard to stage. The news broke 2 days after Sophie signed her witness affidavit. Police arrested Brian at his home early in the morning, in full view of the neighbors. Local stations ran the story like it was a bombshell in the heart of an upscale neighborhood. Aerospace engineer accused of poisoning son to collect $500,000 insurance payout. The broadcast cut between old footage, Brian with neatly combed hair and that confident smile at a conference table, and him being led away in handcuffs. The story spread fast. Online forums started digging up everything. His debts, shady investments, a credit score that had tanked like a rock. Daniel read every word, felt nothing. Not angry, not vindicated, just empty. Like the man in the pictures was someone else entirely, a stranger with a name he used to know. George said nothing. No calls, no media appearances, no comments to reporters. People who'd served with him in the military all said the same thing. He won't speak until there's a verdict. Daniel hadn't expected anything different from his father. But he hadn't expected to run into him either. Not at the hospital, not on a Thursday afternoon, not without warning. Max was still in the ICU. His small body hooked up to tubes and monitors, tiny arms riddled with IVs. Every time a machine beeped, Daniel's chest tightened. He visited every day, without fail. Even if it was just for an hour, to sit beside Max, hold his hand, read him a children's book. That day he just stepped away to refill the warm water in the cup on the bedside table. When he turned back, George was standing in the doorway. White shirt, gray slacks, polished shoes, more gray in his hair. But his posture straight, stiff, like time hadn't dared to weigh him down. They locked eyes. Neither spoke. Daniel instinctively stepped in front of the bed, blocking the view, guarding Max. George didn't move closer, didn't back away. He just stood there, staring at his grandson. 1 minute, then 2. The air between them thick and unmoving, like melting ice refusing to drip. Finally, George spoke, his voice low, steady. "Has the boy woken up?" "Not yet," Daniel replied, flat. George gave a small nod. His eyes dropped to his own hands, then lifted again. Not to Max, but to Daniel. No apology, no gratitude, no emotion at all, except a stillness that bordered on cruel, as if everything that had happened was simply the inevitable cost of some unwritten law. Daniel held Max's small hand gently, gave it a light squeeze. George took one step forward, slow, but still silent. His eyes sank back into their sockets, unreadable. Was it anger, regret, or just exhaustion? Then he said, "You did what you believed was right," and he did what he thought was easiest. Daniel didn't answer. The words hung in the room like a broken piece of furniture, useless, unacknowledged. George exhaled, looked at Max one last time. "I'll cover the medical bills," he said, "not as penance, but because he's my blood." Daniel furrowed his brow, not at the words, but at the tone. Like it was the last promise his father still had the strength to keep. He didn't respond, just leaned down and pulled the blanket up over Max. By the time he looked up, George was already turning away, walking out with the same steady stride he'd had when he wore a uniform. Daniel watched him go. A shadow slipped across the glass door, then vanished. He turned back and sat down beside the bed. Max didn't move. The heart monitor blinked steadily. Daniel took the boy's tiny hand, small enough to disappear inside his own. After a moment, he lowered his head and pressed his forehead gently to the back of it. He said nothing. There was no need. Just the beep of the machine, the rise and fall of breath, and that feeling, light and heavy all at once, rising from deep inside his chest. Brian stood before the judge, wearing a wrinkled orange jumpsuit. The face that once looked polished now glistened with sweat, his eyes hollow, as if sleep hadn't touched him in days. Behind him, a few reporters scribbled notes quietly. Sophie sat in the second row, clutching a tissue, eyes locked on her ex-husband. When the judge asked for an explanation, Brian didn't deflect. He confessed. He had planned it for weeks. He needed the money. He used to believe he would inherit the family legacy, but when everything went to Daniel, even after Daniel left, he began to feel like he was nothing more than a spare. "I just wanted him to look at me, the way he looks at Daniel," Brian said, his voice cracking. "Split the inheritance, sure. But I needed something to prove I wasn't invisible." No one cried. No one shouted. The entire courtroom fell silent, dead silent. The judge issued a provisional sentence pending further investigation. But the real verdict had already been passed. In the eyes of everyone present, Brian, the father, the brother, the son, had destroyed his own family with his bare hands. Max survived, but his liver was severely damaged. At just 5 years old, he now lives on a strict diet, daily medication, and more hospital visits than any other kid in the neighborhood. 3 weeks after the trial, Daniel left the cabin. He never went back. He simply mailed the key to the landowner with one short line: "No reason to keep this place anymore." He moved to a small town less than a 10-minute drive from Sophie's house. Rented a ground-floor apartment with a window facing a patch of grass. Every morning, he made warm water, read the paper, then picked up Max if Sophie was busy. No one asked him to do it, but he did it anyway, quietly. Max slowly got better. Enough to jog around the yard, enough to throw his arms tight around Daniel's neck every time they met, and enough to ask innocent questions like, "Uncle Dan, did you know superheroes don't eat chocolate?" Then giggle when Daniel pretended to be shocked. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel took Max for a walk in the park. The sky was clear, the breeze was soft, and oak leaves were falling all around the playground. They sat on a stone bench while Max used a stick to draw random lines in the dirt. "Uncle Dan," the boy called, drawing out the words, squinting up at him through the sunlight. "Are you sad?" Daniel looked at him. The small face, the jawline uncannily like Brian's, but the eyes were different. Clearer, more honest. "Yes," he said, "but I'm okay." Max nodded, then went back to playing, as if that answer was all he needed. Daniel looked out at the field where other kids were throwing balls, shouting, laughing. The wind brushed his collar, cold but not biting. And in that moment, he let out a sigh. Not from exhaustion, but from relief. Some battles, you don't win. Not because you were wrong, but because the ending wasn't yours to write. But some battles, you survive, and you stay, to protect what's left. This is what he was doing. Holding on to Max. Holding on to the part of himself that hadn't been shattered. The truth doesn't always bring relief. Sometimes it only exposes the kind of loss you can't undo. But staying silent, just to avoid a fracture, can sometimes be the deepest cut of all. Daniel chose to speak, not to punish anyone, but to protect the one thing still whole, an innocent child. No one teaches you how to handle betrayal from your own family. No one tells you what to do once the truth has torn through every belief you used to hold. But maybe the point isn't to preserve a perfect family. Maybe it's to preserve the part of yourself that still knows right from wrong when everything else falls apart. What about you? If you were Daniel, would you choose the truth or stay silent to protect a family already rotting from within? If this story struck a chord with you, make sure to subscribe to Family Drama so you don't miss more stories filled with conflict and emotional depth. And don't forget to leave a comment. We want to know. Would you forgive or would you walk away?